I've been trying this phrase for like 2 hours, so let me know if it goes okay. It's bonjour à tous, comment ça va? Is that okay? So today I come here to talk to you about Restangular 2.0, basically about the new stuff that I'm doing about Restangular. And the best new thing that you'll see about Restangular is in this slide, which is the icon that a friend of mine, which is a designer, did it. That's the best cool thing. I love to have an icon now. So my name is Martin Gontovnikas. My Twitter handle is mgonto. And I am a software developer from Buenos Aires, Argentina. So I had like a very long flight here. And I work at OutZero Incorporation. I used to be coding all day long doing JavaScript. So this was me all day long. I was coding, touching the keyboard, and like a machine, something like that. But now I am working as a developer advocate in OutZero. I started doing that about like 5 or 6 months ago. So this is me now. I'm like smoke selling, right? But I still do code in reality, which is nice because I like it. So we're here to learn about Restangular 2.0 and about the new stuff that are going to be there. We should start now, but previously on Restangular. So I want to first do a recap about Restangular 1.x for the people who doesn't know about it first. So the first thing that happened, I think, like 2 years ago, is that I decided to learn AngularJS. So I've heard about it. I saw it online. It seemed very, very cool. So I started to try it out. So I read a few examples, and I felt like Neo in Matrix, where he hooked something up. It's like, I know Kung Fu, but in my case, it's I know AngularJS. That didn't really happen. So this is what really happened with me, at least with AngularJS. It's like after the example, Senchi model, it just works, and it's like, oh my God, it's marvelous. But then you realize that it's not that easy, and then you learn new things, and it's like that big curve. I remember that I actually refactored a whole page 3 different times, and after the 3rd time, I was like, okay, now I'm starting to understand Angular. So once I learned Angular, I saw that there was $resource. At that time, ng-resource was actually part of AngularJS in the same source file. So I was like, why not? Let's use it. So I had a user, basically a user model. So the first thing that I wanted to do is to fetch it. So I don't know if this is big enough. I can increase the font otherwise. OK. Is it better? Awesome. One more? OK. This is the advantage of doing the presentation and slides with HTML. It's so easy to increase the size. So what am I doing here? The first thing I'm doing is actually fetching the user. So for that, what I'm doing is I have an API version 1, and then defining that the user resource and setting that I want to get a user for a certain user ID. So I'm declaring the $resource object, and then calling on user.get, having the user ID there, and finally, set it, once I have it, just change the name of it and calling $save. That $save will do, in this case, the put correctly. So far, so good. I am getting the user. It's like 4 or 5 lines of code. It was OK. Then what I needed is to actually get a list of cars for that user. Those cars are a nested RESTful resource from that user. So I wanted to get that. And what did I need to do? I needed to create, again, another $resource object. And in there, I needed to specify the full URL. It was /API, /version1, /the user again, the user ID, /cars, /car ID, etc. So I had to put the whole URL again to get that car resource. Once I have that, I just call this car.query again. I get the first car, and I change the name. And then I call save, which will, in this case, do a put. So I didn't like it that much, this case. So first, $resource thought that models didn't have relationships. The reality is that my models are always related to another, either via restful resources or some way. And I didn't want to actually put the whole URL and do that in my own. I actually wanted to do it myself. Also, the configurations that I do for each of those resources have to be for each of them. And I cannot do it globally, or I cannot do it per group. So I didn't like it that much. And that's why I decided to build Restangular. Well, I didn't actually decide to build it. I was working with some freelance projects and started doing something simple, and then I thought maybe it could be useful for other people. So, of course, it took me a lot of time to decouple it for my project because it's always coupled in the beginning. But then I ended up doing something like this. The first thing that you could do is set the base URL. So that's the base URL for all the requests. It's always API version 1. In the future, if I'm changing this to API version 2, version 3, or whatever, I just change it here and it would just work. Then what I'm doing is calling this one method from Restangular, which is basically like a proxy to a certain resource. In this case, I'm saying, OK, I want the resource user with ID 123. Then I'm calling get. This will always return a promise because promises are first-class citizens in Restangular. And then when I receive the user, I just change the name and call put again. Now, the main difference comes with when I want to actually get the list of cars. So in here, what I'm doing is from the user itself that I now have on scope, I just say, OK, get me the list of cars. As that user was gotten from API version 1 user 123, this is already known by Restangular. So now, when calling this get list cars, it will actually know that full URL and call it. And then I get the list of cars again, and if I change one of the cars and call put, again, this car will know its own URL. So it will go, that put will be done to the correct URL for that car. And also, I can call this post method on the cars and add a new car. And that car will be added to the cars of these users, because this is still from that nested RESTful resource. My main idea here was to actually create relationships so that they are shown not only in the backend where I have my models, but also in the front end, because models are always related. So now that we know a little bit about how Restangular 1.0 works, let's go back to the future, or back to the present, and back to Restangular 2.0, which is what we want to talk about today. So there are still a few things that are missing in Restangular. So, and that's basically why this talk is about Restangular 2.0. In the beginning, my thought was to actually do Restangular 2.0 for AngularJS 2.0. But as I didn't know the timing, etc., I decided to actually do it for Angular 1.x and then move it forward to Angular 2.0 once it goes out. So let's start with a refactor together. I mean, what is the first thing that I wanted to do for the refactor is to actually know what Restangular does. I mean, I built it, but I kept on adding like new stuff. And the first thing that is important is to know what it does so that I can refactor it. So I started analyzing the steps. So let's go back to that example that I've shown, which is the scope users.getListCars. The first thing I do here is to calculate the URL. So I have this user. I know that that user is for a particular resource. I have its ID. So I need to calculate the full URL for this. Once I have the full URL, I will actually call some pre-request hooks. That pre-request hooks will let me do changes to the request that is going to be done to that URL. In Restangular, currently, the only changes that you can do are to the request params, the header, and the element itself that is being sent, if there's one. But you couldn't cancel the request. And that's something that I noticed doing here, and that's something that I'm planning to change for Restangular 2.0. Then what happens is that I call the API. So basically, I use $HTTP here, and then I just call the server and get the response back. Once I get the response back, I need to parse it. Why? Because when calling this getList, what I've shown you is that I get a list of cars, and that list of cars has some special Restangular methods like post, this same getList, and some others. And for that, I need to get an array. And sometimes your APIs, or my API as well, return like an object which has a field called data, and that field called data is actually an array. And I don't need that, so we need to parse the response to actually return from that object the array itself. Once we parse the response, we do this Restangularized element magic. This Restangularized element, what it does is actually add these new methods and new properties to the object. The only problem with this on Restangular 1.0 is that those methods are actually added to each of the objects. That means that I'm not using prototypes, I'm not using classes, so each time that I get a new object from the server, for example, a user, a car, or whatever, I set those methods to that object. And how do I set them? I actually use Lodash with the bind function. So I bind those methods to the object so that I can use this. The problem with that comes when you want to actually do a copy, which happens a lot of time. Because if you have an object which has a lot of functions binded to that object, and then you copy that, what it does basically is go property by property and just put it in another object. So now I have this second object, and all the functions in the second object, like the put, the post, and all of them, are still binded for the first one. That means that even though if I make changes to the object number 2, once I call put, no change will be sent to the server, because that put will send the object which was binded at this, which was the original one. And that was a very big problem. The other big problem that Restangular had is that I need to add metadata to the object so that I know from which resource it came. It has basically two fields. One is called root, which is like the path of the resource. In this case, it will be cars, because I'm getting a list of cars, so each of those cars will have that cars root. And the other one is a field called parent resource. That parent resource would be the reference to the user that I used to get the car. And I use that parent resource to actually generate this URL. So what I do is I keep on going backwards on the parent resource chain to know exactly what URL to fetch. The problem with that is, again, I'm adding those fields to the object. So then, before calling the API, I need to strip them manually with Restangular. And they are spread around your object. And if you want to debug it, it's kind of a pain in the ass. So another thing that I realized here is that besides wanting to first use prototypes or classes instead of just doing these setting functions to the object, the other thing is that I wanted to add like a $meta or some property where I would hold all of these different properties that I'm adding to the object, like parent resource and root. Then, going on with this flow, once the element is restangularized, what I have is this extend model hook. The idea of this extend model hook, we'll see it in a little bit, is that you can also add your own custom methods to the objects that you receive. Those own custom methods that you add to the objects are also added to that object itself. It's not a prototype. So again, this doesn't look good. We'll see the code in a second, but that's, for me, the biggest problem with Restangular right now, that you have models, you can add new fields, you can add new functions, but it's not really a model. It's just like monkey patching the object. Then, once you extend the model, you have like post-response hooks, where you can do new things with that response. And finally, the data is returned to the user so that he can, well, use it. So now that we understand how everything works, we can actually start the refactor. However, there was one big problem with Restangular. There's only one file in the whole Restangular project, which is restangular.js, because it got bigger and I added new things there and I didn't split it. So these are all the files that are in restangular.js. Not only it's hard to actually understand what's going on, but also if I want to actually get contributions for people, it's really hard, because it's like, okay, I want to add, I don't know, a new property. Where is it? Oh, it's in the line 5,324. Now I get it. So the first thing I started doing in the refactor was this. Well, it doesn't look good because of the size. Was this, to actually start separating this. We'll start talking about the different files that are shown here, but the main idea is to actually separate all that big Restangular.js file to different files. And also the other idea is that these little files that you see here aren't actually actually Angular modules nor Angular services. They are regular JavaScript. And the main idea for that is that not only it's easier to actually get them then and put them all together, but also it's easier then to migrate it to AngularJS 2.0, because as you saw, nothing exists now. I mean, they killed everything. So as they killed everything, I tried to have the Angular.module that I'm using right now only in one file, which is the restangular.js, and the rest are going to be plain prototypes or classes. So I tried, I mean, I'm not killing it, but I'm only having it in one place, so it's dying little by little. And now that we get that, the only other problem that I saw is that this configuration object. The configuration object is something global. And that configuration object is a pain in the ass, because I have my URL service that builds the URL, the fetch service which will fetch the object from the server. And all of those need to know about the configuration. That would mean that I need to inject that configuration everywhere, and I would couple it with everything. So to solve that, what I thought is to make something similar to Java. So I don't like Java, but I did like that approach. And my main idea is that the configuration now is going to be something kind of similar to the application context. The idea is that the configuration will hold all the configurations, and then the configuration will be the one that takes care of instantiating all the services. So it's the one who will instantiate the URL service. And instead of setting the config to the URL service, what it will set is only the configuration that are needed. For example, the URL service needs to know if I'm using absolute URLs or not. And what I'm doing then is creating this URL service object. That URL service object receives an is absolute URL configuration, and that's it. And that's all I set from the config. And that way, I'm decoupling everything, and everything is created through config, but every of the other files don't depend on anything. That was the biggest thing that I realized once I started separating files, because when you have a big one and separating, it's really difficult, trust me. So let's start with the code. Let's not talk anymore. So let's start with extending models. This is how extending models looks like right now in Restangular 1.text. The idea is that I have this restangular.extend model. In here, I can set the resource path, users in this case, and then I receive this model as a callback, and I'm adding here the get full name function. As you can see, I'm just adding this function as monkey patching to the objects, and then when setting the name and the last name, I'm calling this model as well, because I'm not binding this to anything. And this is really not cool. So that's why in Restangular 2.0, the idea is to start using classes. I mean, ECMAScript 6 is here, so I'm actually using prototypes right now for Angular 1.text, but the idea is to move to Traceur. I'm still not I don't like Traceur that much, but I will eventually use it. An idea here is that you would have a class user that extends from Restangular resource, and in there, you just set this getFullName method, and then you do this.name, this.lastname, and that's it. Then in your Restangular config, you said, okay, the configuration for the user's path is actually going to have this model class. And that model class is going to be this user that I'm just showing right now. So the idea with this is to start having classes finally and start having prototypes. The other good thing that I thought about this is that when you are setting these config users, it used to be only a string, but now it can be a regex, because you can have a /users like a base resource, or users could be a nested resource from something else. And in some cases, you want the same class for both. In some cases, you don't. So for that, the idea is that you would set the regex, and then you would set the class that you want to use for that. So I've just shown you that this Restangular resource, you're going to extend from that. So why is that? Because in AngularJS 2.0, at least in the current documentation, the idea is to have this model class. That model class will be the base class for every interaction with the information and with the data. That model class will, what it will do is it will work like with session storage, local storage, offline syncing, and all the different services. That model class always has an instance of iAdapter. I forgot the arrow, now that I see. And that iAdapter, what it does is it adds methods to query for that model. So some of the methods that are in iAdapter are find by ID, find, query, and some others. So I'm going to use that, but the problem was that the methods that are in iAdapter weren't all the ones that I used in Restangular. Restangular has more than them. So what I'm doing now is I'm creating this Restangular base, which is like the base class for every Restangular thing that you're going to get, either a collection or an element, and setting there first the methods that are for either an element and a collection, which would be custom put, custom post, custom get, etc. And that Restangular base will have a Restangular adapter. That Restangular adapter will have this find by ID, find, query, all of those methods implemented, But besides that, it's also adding the other methods that Restangular has, but the iAdapter interface doesn't. And then I'm extending from Restangular base and creating this Restangular element, which represents a single element, and Restangular collection, which represents a collection. Right now, a Restangular collection is an array, and I monkey patch fields to that array. Unfortunately, in JavaScript, it's almost impossible to extend from array. I don't know if you guys have tried it, but the length property, it's a pain in the ass. I mean, I've tried it, but I decided not to go for that. So the only difference that it will have now is that this Restangular collection will have now an elements field, which will be the real array, and all the methods will be in this Restangular collection. So now, hooks. I've told you about hooks before in the flow, and this is how hooks look like in Restangular 1.x. I have this add request interceptor and add response interceptor. I get all of these parameters, like the element itself that is being sent, which is the operation. The operation is like get, put, post, which is the root, the resource name, and the full URL. And then in there, you could do whatever you want and either return the element or element, request params, and the headers, as I was saying. The only problem with this is that it's general. So if you actually wanted to run this request interceptor only for users resource or only for cars, you would have to put an if there. And also, it's global. So what I thought is that since now we're having this user class, we can add these before request and parse response methods in the object itself. I didn't decide if I wanted to actually have these methods are static or as instant methods, like before request could be an instance method. But if it's an instant method and you want to delete a property, for example, like in here, it will mean that you would need to like copy yourself, delete the property, etc. And you would have to do that process. If it's static, I can copy the object before sending it to this object. But I'm not sure about this yet. And also, as I want to be as backward compatible as possible, I'm still going to keep the Restangular.add request interceptor as before. And also, it makes sense to have a global interceptor. A lot of people use it for loading, for example. Before the request, you start a loading, and after the request, you just stop the loading. But the other difference is that now you could also set it for a particular user, for a particular, resource or path in here, and not only in the model. Then inner resources. So I've always worked in the beginning with like Ruby on Rails and things like that. So everything was nested RESTful resources, which made sense, and that was the main idea and main focus of Restangular. However, lately I've been using more Node.js, Mongo, and what you start to see is that as I'm using documents in Mongo, I'm starting to have inner resources. So not only I have nested, but for example, sometimes I return from the API a user object, which has in there the list of cars, the array of cars. And then I want to be able to add a new car. And that was possible with Restangular, with this syntax, which is, it looks like shit, to be honest. It's not cool. It's also mutable. I don't like it at all. But basically what it's doing is this Restangular collection receives the first parameter is like the parent resource, which is the user. The second one is like, which is the field that you want to make to Restangularize user.messages. And the final field is the final parameter is the resource that it's going to be. So with this, you could make it happen. But again, this is not a nice syntax. So now in the restangular.config, besides setting the model class, what you would be able to do is to set relations. There are two ways of setting these relations. It's has one or has many. That's it. And they can receive either a string or an object. If they receive a string, the idea is that that string is both the name of the field and the name of the resource. If it received an object, you can set in there which is the field and then which is the root. Once you have that configuration and you do like before restangular.one users to 3, the first thing that you would see here is that I have users.phones.post, and then in there I can just post a new message to that phones. And that will go to actually /users/123/phones, which is the correct URL. And this syntax is much better, in my opinion, at least, than the one before. Custom services. So the other thing that is like really requested about Restangular is that you don't want to couple your code to Restangular. I mean, you don't want to have the Restangular in every controller, service, or whatever. So the idea was to create services based on Restangular. So what you could do, for example, now is Restangular.service for a certain resource like user. Then you set the model class, which is this service going to return. And from that moment on, you have a user service, which will have the getAll method, the post, and all those different methods. But and Restangular would be encapsulated in that service. The only problem with this is that if you do user service.getAll, it would return the user class. However, as the configuration is being done in the user service, and that user service is only instantiated the first time it's injected, that configuration will not be global. So that means that if you do restangular.allusers.getList, you would still get in there a Restangular resource class. So if you want to avoid that, what you could do is in the config of your application, you can do restangular.config_users.setModelClassUser. And then in the service, just do .serviceUsers. That way, if you use the service or if you use Restangular, in both cases, you would get the user class. And this user service, what it does is like a nicer way to create elements. If you wanted to create a new Restangular object, you would do before restangular.oneUsers. And now you have this user service.$new, which creates like an empty object, but knows to which path it should go. And then this is another example, like you can do the get all the users, create a new one, do post, do remove, etc. And the last part is that I think that the Angular 2.0, a nice move about them is that they're removing controllers, they're removing, as they were saying, services, they're removing lots of things. And that makes the code more standard. That means that the code that you're doing with AngularJS 2.0 is going to actually work with several other things that you can use. And it's not like only the Angular way, as I like to call it. So what I saw from Restangular is that the only coupling that it has to AngularJS is actually $HTTP and $Q for promises. So the idea, this is after the refactor, so it's not going to be right now, but the idea is that people would be able to use Restangular without AngularJS. So what you would have is, I will create like a wrapper for $Q and $HTTP for Angular, and then you could have a wrapper for regular Q and for $.ajax, for example, from jQuery. And that way, you could use Restangular without Angular, even though it's part of the name. So I hope you've liked what's going on, what's coming next. So as I was saying, this is still a work in progress. I haven't yet finished this. But the refactor, as I've said, is already started for AngularJS. You can see right now, if you go to the 2.0 dash, I think it's dash in English, right? Sorry, I speak like Spanish. Whip, if you go there, you will see the work in progress right now. Also, there's an issue on GitHub where if you have suggestions or whatever, you can just put it there. And of course, I'll take it into account because, as I was saying, this is a work in progress. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening, or at least pretending to.